So hello everyone, welcome. My name is Alana Weiss and I work on the Learning and Leadership Development team here at Google. And today it is my pleasure to welcome Daniel Pink to the Leading at Google series. Many of us are here today because we are big fans of Daniel's last bestseller, A Whole New Mind, Why Right-Brainers Will Rule the Future. As Googlers who love data, we appreciate his use of hard science to drive his insights. Daniel is an expert on economic transformation and the new workplace, and his articles on business and technology appear in publications including the New York Times, Harvard Business Review, and Wired, where he is also a contributing editor. Dan jokes that he held his last real job in the White House, where he served from 1995 to 97 as chief speechwriter to Vice President Al Gore. He also worked as an aide to U.S. Labor Secretary Robert Reich. Today, we're also lucky to be among the first to hear from Daniel about his new book, which just came out last week, and today it is number 3 on the Wall Street Journal list. And his book is called Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. Please join me in welcoming Dan Pink.
All right, thank you, Alana, for that nice introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here. It's great. This is my first trip to the Googleplex, and I think on the way out I'm going to get a haircut. So it's really kind of cool. I was saying to Alana, this idea of this kind of mobile haircutting place, we actually have that in my neighborhood in Washington, D.C., but it's for dogs. It's a sort of roving dog grooming place. And I say, oh my God, I got to apply this to human beings. This is awesome. Well, it is great to be here, and I'm actually really excited to talk about this new book, Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us, which is about the truly endlessly fascinating and interesting topic of motivation and what motivates us and why we do what we do. But before we do that, I just have a quick question. I know that it's lunchtime. Has anyone not eaten lunch? All right, wow, a lot of you. All right, now there's a smell of food wafting from the cafeteria down here. Some of your colleagues are eating food. I bet some of you who haven't had lunch are hungry. Anybody who hasn't had lunch hungry? Pretty hungry. Who's pretty hungry? You pretty hungry? What's your first name? John. John is pretty hungry. You're pretty hungry, John. All right, we're establishing that. Here you go. Can you come up here for a second, John? On the way over here, I went to Quiznos, and here's a sub and some Cheetos. All right? Enjoy your lunch. All right? Now, you can sit down now, John. What did we just see there, ladies and gentlemen? We saw motivation right there, right? John exemplified one of our drives that we have as human beings. We have a biological drive, right? We eat to sate our hunger. We drink to slake our thirst. We have sex to satisfy our carnal urges. That is part of what it means to be human. No one would say that's not part of what it means to be human, right? But no one would also say that that's all it is to be human, right? Because humans are more complex than that. So let's try something else here. Martin. Hang on a second, Martin. Now, we know this is for the YouTube video series, Leading at Google. And so, Martin, if you come up here right now and hold this book to that camera for 30 seconds, I'll give you $10. Sure. All right. Martin Syke, okay. Hold it right there. All right. So I want to get my money's worth, $30. I mean, 30 seconds, all right? So we're at like 15 now, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7. Look interested in the book, please. 6, 5, 4, 3. A little thumbs up sign. 2, 1. Thank you, Martin. All right, don't sit down. Can you hold this for a second, Martin?
Sure.
Now let's hope I have $10.
I'll take a 20.
There you go. Here's $10. Martin, thank you. All righty. There you go. Give Martin a round of applause. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's also motivation, right? That's another form of motivation. Human beings respond exquisitely to rewards and punishments in their environment. You reward something, you typically get more of it. You punish something, you typically get less of it. I mean, it's a shame that we couldn't show Martin's face on this screen. Because when I said, I'll give you if you come up here, I'll give you $10, Martin's, I mean, I'm not joking around. And I'm assuming Martin is not like woefully underpaid, okay? Maybe he deserves to be, but he's not. Martin's, I'm not joking around here, this is true. Martin's eyes widened. It was like, I'll give you $10. Martin's like, oh, and he's out of his seat, ready to stand up. Now, Martin, have you and I ever met? Have you and I, have you ever read, have you read this book? No. So here's Martin. For $10, Martin's willing to come up in front of his peers, onto a TV camera, and hold up for 30 seconds a book he's never read by an author he's never met. All for $10. Money's a powerful motivator. Carrots and sticks are powerful motivators. But that second drive to respond to rewards and punishments in our environment is obviously part of what it is to be human. But it's not all that it is to be human. No one would ever say that's all we are. We have other drives too, right? We have the John drive, the biological drive. We have the Martin drive, the reward and punishment drive. But we also have a third drive. We do things because they're interesting. We do things because we like to do them. We do things because we're curious, because we want to learn, because we want to make a contribution. That is also part of what it is to be human, that third drive to do things for their own sake, because they're interesting, because we get better at them, because they've advanced some kind of purpose. Now, does that make sense? We have those drives. And for those of you who, actually, there are a handful of you who looked a little skeptical at that claim of this third drive. And for you, let me ask the following question. If you're skeptical of the existence of this third drive, what are you doing here? No, I mean that. What are you doing here in this hour that we're going to spend here at this little session? It's a very, very attractive audience, full of attractive people. But my guess is that in the next 45 minutes, no one is going to find a mate, okay? So it's probably not going to answer your biological urges being here. Second, except for Martin, no one's making a buck here in the next hour, right? So why are you here? You're here because you're curious. You're here because you want to learn. You're here because you're part of a community. You're here because you're going to engage. That third drive is fundamental to what it is to be a human being. The trouble is, and I think that you should be grateful, I think that you should be grateful working here. The trouble is that in many businesses, Google being the exception in many ways, many businesses treat human beings as if that third drive doesn't exist, and that the second drive is what it's all about. So that the way that they architect the systems in their company, the way they architect the compensation schemes, the way they architect their human resources policies, is really built around carrots and sticks, around if-then rewards. If you do this, then you get that. And here's the thing, and for this book I looked at, and I'm grateful to Alana for mentioning that a lot of the books that I read are very much grounded in the science. I looked at 40 years of research, 50 years of research in the field of behavioral science. Huge numbers of experiments by economists, by sociologists, by psychologists about what really motivates us. And what is clear from this 40 or 50 years of research is that those carrot and stick motivators, those if-then motivators, if you do this, then you do that, they work. They work really, really well. But they only work in a surprisingly narrow band of circumstances. A surprisingly narrow band of circumstances. And that for many things that we do, and much of the work that you do here, those kinds of motivators, those if-then motivators, don't work. In fact, they often do harm. So let me try to lay out some of this case to you, because the research on this is absolutely fascinating, and so much of the research on human motivation is counterintuitive. We have this notion that human beings are these purely mechanistic creatures, that if you simply push the levers the right way at the right time, people will do what you expect them to do. And that ain't true. We're a lot more complicated than that. Let me give you some experiments, because experiments are totally cool. I mean, I don't want to, it's warm in here. I don't want to empty the room by reciting all 40 years of research. But some of these studies are totally interesting and cool, except my clicker is in my pocket. That sounds like, my clicker is in my pocket. That sounds like a euphemism, doesn't it? My clicker is in my hand, which also sounds like a euphemism. Where was I? Oh, yes, we're talking about the science. Okay, it's cool. Let me tell you about some experiments, because these experiments are really, really interesting, and they're really, really surprising. So, let me tell you about one experiment that comes from the mean streets of Cambridge, Massachusetts, all right? at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. Very interesting piece of research done by some economists there. Some economists at MIT in collaboration with an economist at Carnegie Mellon and at the University of Chicago. So really, not only the mainstream of the economics profession, but in some ways sort of the elite mainstream of the economics profession. And they did this really interesting study. They gave these MIT students a series of challenges, a series of games and other kinds of tasks to play. Some physical tasks. Can you throw a ball through a hoop? Memorizing strings of digits, solving complex conceptual puzzles, a whole set of challenges. And they said, we're going to incentivize you. We're going to incentivize you and reward you based on your performance. So if you do reasonably well, you get this small monetary reward. If you do medium well, you get a medium monetary reward. But if you do really well, if you're one of the top performers, you get a sizable monetary reward. Okay? The classic kind of motivational scheme. Now, what happened? Let's go to the videotape, or it's not videotape, but let's go to this. As long as the task involved only mechanical skill, bonuses worked as they would be expected. The higher the pay, the better the performance. Nothing surprising about that, right? Here's where the surprise comes. But once the task called for even rudimentary cognitive skill, look at that phrase again, rudimentary cognitive skill, and in an incredibly innovative act of right brain thinking, I've made it red. In a rudimentary cognitive skill, a larger reward led to poorer performance. Now that's kind of weird, isn't it? That's not the way it's supposed to work. We know if you want something, if you want more of something, reward it. But that's not happening here. So they say, this is weird. What's going on here? So they test the assumption. Maybe giving $50 to a student in MIT isn't sufficiently motivating. So let's take the same experiment and do it somewhere else. Let's do it in Madurai, India. Rural India, where the standard of living is far lower, so a reward that's modest by American standards is going to be more impactful. Same deal. Small rewards, medium rewards, large rewards. Same set of tasks. Here's what happened this time. People offered the medium reward did no better than people offered the small reward. But this time around, people offered the largest reward. They did worst of all. Here we go. In 8 of the 9 tasks we examined across 3 experiments, higher incentives led to worse performance. This is strange. This is not what I learned when I studied economics. This is not the way it's supposed to work. This seems to defy some of the laws of behavioral physics. This seems, in its own way, vaguely leftist and socialist to me. It sort of undercuts this certain tenets of capitalism. Okay? But who sponsors? First of all, these are done by economists. Let's look at the socialist organization that sponsored the research. Federal Reserve Bank. So this is the mainstream of the mainstream. Top-flight economists sponsored by the Federal Reserve saying higher incentives can lead to worse performance. Here's what's interesting about this. We think that if you reward something that you want, you get more of it, and that is not always the case. And particularly for creative conceptual tasks, that is actually rarely the case. If you offer an if-then incentive for a kind of conceptually challenging, complex task, people routinely perform worse. This is actually so clear that it's hardly even controversial in the world of behavioral science. It's hardly even controversial, and we see it over and over and over again. So let's talk about, that's rewards, let's talk about punishments, because punishment is actually a very powerful motivator as well. And punishment is much more predictable. So let's go from the mean streets of Cambridge to the country of Israel, and let's talk about some daycare centers in Israel who had a problem. Daycare centers in Israel, the chain of daycare centers, they noticed that some parents were coming up late to pick up their kids. You had to come and pick up your kid by 4 p.m. Some parents were coming late. So how do you disincentivize people from showing up late? What would you do? Charge them. Exactly. You charge them. You impose a fine. You impose a penalty. Absolutely right. Commonplace practice. So that's what they do. They say, you know what? People are showing up late. That's wrong. We're going to stop this behavior. If you punish something, you get less of it. So they put up this sign. Announcement. Fine for coming late. As you know, the official closing time is 4 o'clock. Since some parents have been coming late, we, and of course, with the approval of the Authority for Daycare Centers in Israel, have decided to impose a fine on parents who came late to pick up their children. As of next Sunday, a fine of 10 Israeli shekels, about $6 US, will be charged every time a child is collected after 410. So it's every child, many people have more than one kid there, every child, every instance, you're paying a fine. This fine will be calculated monthly. It is to be paid together with the regular monthly payment. Sincerely, the manager of the daycare center. So, of course, tell me your first name. Patsy? So, of course, Patsy had the same instinct that I had. You want to deter this behavior, charge them for it. And, of course, when you charge them for it, what happens, Patsy?
Sometimes they're happy.
After the introduction of, sorry, Patsy, that was kind of a rhetorical question. After the introduction of the fine, we observed a steady increase in the number of parents coming late. The rate was finally settled at a level that was higher and almost twice as large as the initial one. So you impose a fine to deter bad behavior, and the consequence of the fine is you get more of the bad behavior? And then what happens? You double the rate of bad behavior, and then when you withdraw, I don't have this in there, when they withdrew the fine, what happened? The incident, no, it didn't go down. The incidence of lateness stayed up. You did permanent damage. Now, this seems on a surface, as we think about things, if we think about human beings as these purely mechanistic creatures, it seems inexplicable. But Patsy, seriously, how would you explain this result? You said it's no big deal to show up late, I'll just pay the money. Why were people showing up late, why were most people showing up on time in the first place under the earlier regime?
They didn't think they had an option, probably.
They didn't think they had an option? What is another reason you think they might have been showing up on time? Social convention, okay, what else? Guilty? Shame? They like their kids? They didn't want their child to sit on the street? Here's the thing. Okay, this is good. Their relationship with the caregiver was not a purely economic market relationship. They wanted to be fair to the person, and not just any person, the person caring for their children. So they had a social obligation, social convention. I would see your social and raise it moral. That is, they have a moral obligation in some ways. They have a relationship, and that encouraged them to, that's why most people actually complied with the rule. But what it did is it shifted this out of the social realm into the market realm, and it became nothing more than it became similar to buying the bag of Cheetos I got for John, all right? Hey, I want 3 bags of Cheetos. Open up your wallet, buy 3 bags of Cheetos. And so human beings are not that mechanistic. We do things for other reasons. We do things because they're good, and because we care about other people, and because we want to maintain that relationship. So when you look at the science, it actually calls into question a lot of what we think about human beings. And so here's the gist of it. We're going to talk about how this applies to work, but let me just give you in some ways, the thumbnail sketch here. If you want people to do work that is routine, that is rule-based, I can use this word here. If you want people to do work that is algorithmic, okay, where you are, this is the only place on the planet where you can say the word algorithmic and 1/3 of the audience smiles in response to that one word. It's almost this Pavlovian nerd instinct. Algorithmic. Whoa. If the work is algorithmic, that is, there's a set of rules, a process that you follow, a clear set of steps that leads to a single conclusion, the carrot and stick motivators are excellent for that kind of work. They're really good. For work that's not especially interesting, carrot and stick motivators are pretty good. One of the dangers of carrot and stick motivators is that they can sometimes dampen or even extinguish people's intrinsic motivation for a task. But if there's no intrinsic motivation to extinguish, then you're not taking a big risk. So for tasks that are simple, tasks that aren't especially interesting, tasks where you want a short-term result, carrot and stick motivators are awesome if you want short-term results. Awesome. You get the Martins of the world leaping out of their seat for $10 instantly. Uninteresting, not particularly interesting, not especially complicated, short-term, they're awesome. But here's the thing. How much of the work that you do at Google is not especially interesting, not especially complicated, and only has short-term results. Maybe some portion of it, but the vast majority of what you do is actually reasonably interesting. It's actually quite sophisticated and complicated and conceptual. And you actually want the results to endure for a long time. And for those kind of work, these contingent if-then motivators simply don't work. There's 40 years of science that says this. And the danger is, at least from my perspective, is that the science hasn't migrated to the business world. That many people, I think this company is an exception, many aspects of the business world, many institutions of the business world are basically operating on notions of human motivation that is rooted in folklore, not in science. But I think if you listen to the science, you can run your companies in a fundamentally different way, and there's some really cool examples of how to do it differently. So let's talk about how to do this. Number one, money is a motivator. Money is a motivator. We saw it with Martin. Money is a motivator. But money is a motivator in a slightly different way than we think. The gist of it basically is that for money to be a motivator, you gotta pay people enough. If people aren't being treated fairly, if people feel like they're being compensated inadequately, if they feel like someone in the adjoining office or adjoining cube who's doing similar work or isn't as good is getting paid more than them, you don't have motivation. That is a motivation sinkhole. If people can't support their family, this notion of a third drive is nonsense, okay? But once you pay people enough, in fact, once you pay people a little bit more than enough, what you do as a motivator is you take the issue of money off the table so people can focus on their work. That is the best use of money as a motivator, to take the issue of money off the table. Now, after the fact, profit sharing, even stock options, those are less corrosive. It's very difficult for any single one of you to game, to basically, I hope it's very difficult for any of you to single-handedly game the Google stock price. I hope that's true. You might be smarter than I give you credit for, but I hope that's true. So after the fact, it's not so bad, but contingencies are bad. Pay people enough so that they don't think about money, they think about work. What else can you do? Well, there's three components the science shows us that really lead to effective, enduring motivation, especially for complicated conceptual tasks. They are autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Let's start with autonomy, which is in some ways the first among equals. We want to be self-directed. We want to direct our own lives. That is human nature. There's a notion out there, in companies not like this one, that if human beings were left alone, without the threat of a punishment, without the dangling of a carrot, people would do nothing. There's sort of the lump view of human nature. I'm serious. There are plenty of people who believe this. Plenty of people who believe that if people were not threatened with a punishment or enticed with a reward, they would just sit there and do nothing. Now, what's curious about this is that no one ever believes this about him or herself. They only believe it about other people. And I think it's wrong. I think that is not human nature. That human nature is to be active and engaged. That is, let's use a computer metaphor here. I think that being active and engaged and curious, that is our default setting. That is our default setting, okay? When the product ships, when the box ships, that's the default setting, to be active and engaged. And if any of you have kids or have seen kids, I have yet to see a 2-year-old who's not active and engaged. I have yet to see a 4-year-old who's not active and engaged. It is manifest as day that that is our natural state, that is our default setting. Now, I have seen plenty of 14-year-olds and 34-year-olds and 44-year-olds who are not active and engaged, who are passive and inert. But looking at that doesn't mean that's their natural state. What it means is that the default got changed through a whole set of experience. But if we awaken that default, I think great things can happen. And I think you guys have done, actually, in many ways, a masterful job of that. Truly, masterful job of that. And I've said that in venues other than this one, just for credibility's sake. I mean, I used to work in politics before I chose the equally noble calling of writing business books. And one person in politics, actually a legendary political consultant, we were in a meeting, legendary political consultant, we were in a meeting and he leaned over to me and he said something sort of kind of unctuous, cloying to the person in charge. And he leaned over to me and almost in a stage whisper he said, "In politics you can never pander too much." And I think that's true in politics. I don't think that's true here. So that's my credibility is that I've said this other places. But let's not talk about you. Let's talk about some other cool places. Cool places that might yield some lessons for this equally cool place. Let's talk about this company. Yes, this company. Atlassian. Atlassian, Australian company, software company, small, obviously much smaller than Google. Atlassian has some offices in San Francisco along with Sydney. They do something really cool. Once a quarter, they say to their software developers, you can work on anything you want for the next 24 hours. It starts usually Thursday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Starting now, you can work on anything you want as long as it's not part of your regular job. You can work on it with whomever you want. You can work on it the way you want. You can work on it wherever you want. The only thing we ask is that at the end, at 4 o'clock on Friday, you show what you've created to the rest of the company. Okay, but not in this kind of Star Chamber, American Idol kind of setting, but in this kind of, no, seriously, it's like kind of, it's sort of like, I don't know, are TGIFs fun here? They are. Okay, so it's sort of like the poor man's TGIF, where you show the results to the company at the end of those 24 hours. They have beer and cake and other kinds of things like that. I guess other kinds of things like that would be carbohydrates. They call these things FedEx days. Why? Because you have to deliver something overnight. Little Australian humor. Well, it turns out that this one day of intense, undiluted autonomy has produced this whole array of software fixes, a whole array of ideas for new products that had never otherwise emerged. Now, this was not a contingent motivator. If you do this, then you get that. This is basically leaving people alone, saying, do something cool if you feel like it, and getting out of their way. One day of intense autonomy produced these things. And they have actually then raised it, which is something much more familiar to you. I don't even want to talk about it here, which is they now, because of the success of FedEx Days, they now do 20% time. So FedEx Days turned out to be this kind of baby step on the way to 20% time, which you obviously do here. And for those of you watching at home who don't know about 20% time done here at Google, some people can spend 20% of their time, although no one ever hits that mark usually, 20% of their time working on anything they want, and Google keeps the IP rights. Give you another example of this, because here's the thing that's really important to me personally, just as a human being. This is not reserved only for people who are doing high-level, sophisticated work like you are, okay? This urge for autonomy and self-direction is a human urge, and it's possible to infuse this in all kinds of jobs, in all kinds of work. And let me give you an interesting example of this. Let's take call centers. Let's take call centers. Has anybody ever worked in a call center? Okay, right back. You worked in a call center, right there, you with the glasses. Tell me. It was an early call center here, so we don't want to talk about that. How about a less evolved call center? Anybody? Oh yeah, you worked in a call center. Tell me what it was like. How long ago was it?
It was 10 years ago. I supported systems for 10 years ago. I supported systems for Amazon.com's call centers.
Okay, so I don't want to bring in another brand here. No, but
I did the work.
yeah. Okay, so tell me what was it like working at a call center? Describe the physical setting. It doesn't have to be where you said it was, but just in general. You're packed in.
You're at no invisible time. You're always visible to somebody.
You're always visible. Ooh, that's a nice way to put it. You're always visible to somebody. So it's basically a warren of cubicles, hamster-like cubicles. You had a headset on.
Right.
Headset on. You're always visible to somebody. That's an interesting way to put it. Were your calls monitored?
Oh yeah, like your manager wanders over and just sits down and starts listening.
Sits down and starts listening. And were your calls timed?
Oh yeah.
Okay. How long did you stay at this job?
I did it over Christmas as part of Amazon's.
Don't say the name again. Yeah.
It's a high turnover job. 6 months is long.
It's a high turnover job. 6 months is long. That's exactly right. You want it to tell me your first name?
Benji.
Benji? As Benji says, it's a high turnover job. You did a brilliant job of describing it. It's like you're sitting there in a hamster cage with your time monitored, your voice being listened to, and people are not calling to see how you're doing. They're calling because they're a little bit miffed about this, that, or the other thing, right, Benji? So, so you know what the turnover rate is in the call center industry? Annual? About 100%. I mean, think about that for a second. It'd be like if you came back here a year from now, on average, it'd be a totally different group of people. I mean, that's basically, essentially treating human beings like light bulbs. Oop, a light bulb burnt out. Go to the closet, get another one. Screw it in. Now, there's a notion out there that this kind of job is sort of inherently soul-hollowing, inherently deadening. But that's not the case. So let's talk about it a different way. How could you do this a different way? Well, talk to the good folks at Zappos. Okay? Talk to the good folks at Zappos. Here's what Zappos does. Trains their call center representatives over 2 weeks. Here's our policies. Here's our values. Here's our approach to customer service. And then they do something totally cool and just kind of wacky, bizarre in motivational terms. They say, if at the end of those 2 weeks of training you don't want to work at here, I'll give you $2,000. Isn't that, I don't even know what to call that. You know what I mean? I mean, I seriously don't know how to describe, it's like a negative carrot or something like that. And then they go and they take their jobs as call center representatives, and here are their instructions. Serve the customer, solve the customer's problem. That's it. Do it the way you want. If it takes you 1 minute, great. If it takes you 1 hour, no problem. Now, of course, they get feedback from customers to make sure they're being treated well. Well, what happens? Zappos comes out of nowhere to be one of the highest customer service ranked companies in any industry in this country, higher than the Four Seasons. Okay? Taking this job that we think is inherently deadening, infusing it with some autonomy, boom! People perform because we're not innately passive and inert. Let's talk about mastery. Mastery is a second urge. Mastery is our desire to get better at something, particularly better at something that matters. It is a fundamental human impulse. It is so powerful that people do things that seem economically irrational. Okay? Let's talk about economic irrationality, and let's talk about open source. Now, open source in economic terms is very weird. Okay? And we forget that. We're so kind of anchored in the present, we forget that. So if you go back, say, 15 years or 20 years, and if you described open source as a business model to anybody, particularly an economist or a business school professor, they would think that you were high. I mean, imagine, oh, I got this great business model. It's 1995. Hey, I got this great business model. Here's what it is. People will work to create software. Okay, 1995, the year of Windows 95, right? Here, and those of you who remember, you remember when Windows 95 came out, it was like huge news, okay? But, I think there's another model out there. And here's how it would work. You got these people, these really technically skilled people who fetch decent wages in the labor market. And what they do is they volunteer their labor. They work really hard for free. And then, wait, it gets better. Then they give away their product. You with me? This is going to be awesome. I don't think you could go down to Menlo Park or any venture capital firm or any economist or anybody who thought they knew anything about business. They would say, doesn't quite work that way. That seems actually vaguely delusional to think that it could. You look at something like, what's curious about this is that they're wrong. It does work. Linux. It does work. Apache. It does work reasonably well. Wikipedia. You realize that Microsoft, who created an encyclopedia vaguely around the same time as Wikipedia, who had all the right incentives, all the things that economists or business school professors would tell you to do, and Carter's out of business. Wikipedia is the biggest encyclopedia in the world. That seems to have almost biologically impossible 15 years ago, and yet that's what it is. So what's going on? Why are people doing this? Think about motivation, think about mastery and open source from the employer's perspective. Here you have technically sophisticated people doing demanding work for decent wages, but their urge for something is so deep that they spend their discretionary time doing equally, if not more challenging work for someone else for free. Think about being the employer. You say, what am I missing? What am I not providing? The question that economists ask, because this is a very curious puzzle. They ask the question, and here's what they find out. The biggest motivator is enjoyment-based intrinsic motivation. How creative people feel while working on the project. That's what it is. People are looking for challenges. They're looking to get better. They're looking for mastery. They're looking for engagement. You see this over and over and over. Another example, just to go to even, and this is percolating to the mainstream, in a place like Harvard Business Review. Harvard Business Review has a story in the January issue, good piece of research, about what motivates people at work. Long, multi-year study of what motivates people at work, where people kept very extensive time diaries over several years to report how they were feeling, to report their subjective well-being. Over the years, they find this, there's one motivator above all. One motivator stands out well above anything else. And here's what it is. Making progress in one's work. Making progress. That was the biggest motivator for people. Making progress. And the really good managers out there are managers who recognize this, who recognize progress, who say, wow, yesterday you were here, today you're here. Who help people, who honor that, who respect that, who help people move toward that, making progress. What about incentives? Here's what the Harvard researchers say. The key to motivation doesn't depend on elaborate incentive systems. In fact, the people in our study rarely mentioned incentives. Making progress is the biggest motivator. Finally, let's skip that. Last but not least, purpose. Purpose. We want to be part of a cause larger than ourselves. That's part of what it is to be human. We perform at a higher level sometimes when we're animated by some kind of bigger purpose. We perform at a higher level when we feel like our contributions to teammates actually create something bigger than we could create ourselves. Very, very powerful motivator. And purpose, I think more broadly, is becoming an enormous animator of effective business today. And you see that here. Your mission, what is to organize the world's information, right? So that people can, what's the rest of it? Say again? So it's universally available. Organize the world's information so it's universally available and useful. Okay. This looks like it's sort of a surprise to some of you, which is alarming, but no, trust me. Check your website. That's a big transcendent purpose. Think about that purpose. That is not profit maximization. That's not a purpose. That is not even delight and engage customers. It is at a higher order of magnitude than that. It is about some kind of transcendent purpose. And what you see here more and more among effective businesses is that we have the profit motive. The profit motive is a good thing. The profit motive is actually a really good thing. The profit motive is one reason why we have such a high standard of living. I think the profit motive is good. It's not universally, permanently, unequivocally good, but I think the profit motive is good. Good in the sense of effective, and actually good in the sense of moral in its own way. But the profit motive is not the only thing. And what's happening now more and more is that if you want really talented people to come work at a place, you gotta have a bigger purpose, okay? Maximizing shareholder gain is not gonna get a lot of people up in the morning. Is not gonna say, wow, I'm gonna do something really cool. I'm gonna, if you had a mission of maximizing shareholder gain, I don't think you would have that groovy thing that Alana just showed me, Ahmed's globe, right? That's unbelievable, okay? If you're animated by profit seeking, you're not gonna get that kind of stuff. You're not gonna get the cool stuff. And so what I think's going on right now is that the profit motive, in order to be effective, but also to be good in a deeper sense, has to be anchored in some way to the purpose motive. That when the profit motive becomes unmoored from the purpose motive, sometimes bad things happen, but also it's less effective. It's really less effective. And I think that we see this in the higher performing organizations today. And I'll give you this one quote from a venture capitalist, an investor. He says, today you have to have a purpose bigger than your product. You have to have a purpose bigger than your product. And I think that's a lot of what you're doing here, and I think it explains your success. So it's a delight to be with here because I think in many ways, not in all ways, but in many ways, your purpose is bigger than your product. In many ways, you have people in this place who have the privilege of being able to move toward mastery, and you actually have a more autonomous, self-directed environment than in most places. And I think that's the recipe not only for a great company, but I think it's a recipe for a good company. And so my hat's off to you. So let's take some questions. Yes? Yeah. Yeah, how would you frame the behavior of the financial industry in response to these things? It is pretty clear. This goes back to the utterly shocking slide that I put up there that money is a motivator, okay? If you give people, one of the dangers of carrot and stick if-then rewards, particularly if they're short-term and high stakes, is that some people many people will take any route there, even if it means cheating. There's no question about that, and that's some of what we saw. The other thing is that people become myopic in the sense that they don't see the long-term consequences of it, and they don't care, even if it's against their own self-interest. So you bundle up a package of securities based on essentially fraudulent, not in the legal sense, dicey mortgages, and then pass it off to somebody else. Short-term, all is good. Long-term, you could be caught in the total downdraft of this whole economy. So it forces us to be myopic, and it also gets us to be very, it narrows the breadth of our thinking as well. So you actually become, in some ways, less creative. So I think that in many ways, the financial crisis, an element of it shows you what happens when it's all carrot and stick, or it's all carrot, and when people have, and especially short term. And the short term thing is actually really important because if the payoff is only short term, people will respond to that. There's pretty little question about that. Now, let's go more broadly. Let's talk about executive compensation here for a moment, because I think it's a sort of connected issue. The thing about executive compensation that I think is actually does verge on fraudulent, not in the legal sense, but in the sort of the moral sense, is that a lot of executive compensation isn't even an if-then incentive. Here's what it is. If you're an executive, a high-level executive, and your company does well, you get a huge amount of money. If you're an executive and you run your company into the ground, you get a huge amount of money. So it's not even like an incentive as much as it is an entitlement in that regard. Now, there's also this talk out there that you hear in the financial industry, hey, if we didn't pay these outlandish salaries, these people wouldn't work here, right? You've heard that, okay? I actually think that's a very interesting research question. Let's try it, okay? I'm serious. Let's try it. Let's see what it is empirically. You're making it's an interesting hypothesis. Let's test it empirically. I actually think that you get a lot of talented people going to jobs that pay $500,000 a year, even if 2 years ago they paid $3 million a year. So I think there's a lot of it's somewhat irritating because of the. It's more than somewhat irritating. It's extremely irritating because of those kinds of factors. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. If you force caps on CEO pay, you take away that person's autonomy. You mean sort of government caps? Right. Yeah, I think you're right about that, actually. And I think that sort of imposing a solution to this from the top down is not going to work, because it's sort of squeezing a balloon. And so people are going to come up with workarounds around it. You saw this in the early 1990s when they put a high sort of a super tax on executive compensation above the then lofty figure of $1 million. And so what happened is that everybody put their regular compensation at $1 million and then found other ways to compensate people that were even more lucrative. So I don't think the solution is necessarily to impose law or regulation to stop that. I think the solution is actually in the hands of shareholders. I think the solution is in the hands of boards. And you have very compliant boards. Google's the exception. You have very compliant boards, and you have actually very passive shareholders. And the shareholders are getting mistreated. Who's next? What are your questions? Yes?
Were there other kind of aspects of motivation that you considered that didn't quite make the cut?
Well, we have all kinds of motivations. I mean, fear is a great motivator. And so these kind of things. I mean, I think there's an interesting thing about what you see in open source is that people say, well, what about reputation? What about a claim? Is that a motivator? And it is in a way, but not quite in the pure way that we think. Because if you think about reputation and a claim, it is itself a form of feedback. It gives you a sense of feedback, and feedback is necessary if you want to move toward mastery. And so what's curious, I'll tell you about one study about this, about sort of the importance of feedback and reputation. It's an interesting study of artists. So they studied these artists in the 1960s who were at the Art Institute School in Chicago. Okay? They were preparing to be artists. And they talked to they interviewed these students, and they did these qualitative interviews to find out what their motivation was. And they noticed two groups of people, basically, because they were curious, why are people coming to art school? What do they want to get out of art school? How does it fit into their path? And so they noticed that some people had very much an extrinsic orientation. Okay? I'm really good at art, and I can become rich and famous doing art. That was one motivator for people. I want the acclaim. I think I'm really good at it. I think I can make a decent living off of it. There were other people who had a more intrinsic orientation. I want to paint. I love painting. It's cool. It's what I do. Okay? Sometimes you talk to artists, they don't even have they can't even articulate why they're it's like, this is what I do. Okay? So you had two different orientations there. Now, what's so interesting about this is that, so they use this data to figure out admission. Okay, we have two different kinds of mindsets coming in here. We got, okay, da-da-da. So this sits there for a while. Somebody then realizes that there's this trove of qualitative data 20 years later. Wow, I wonder what happened to these folks. It's fascinating, right? Follow up, what happens? Well, it turned out that a decent number of them actually had attained decent amounts of acclaim and had great reputations and actually were making good livings as artists. And you know who they were? The intrinsically oriented ones. So there's this kind of Zen-like thing going on that if you pursue it, you won't attain it. You know? Grasshopper. And that's so interesting. So it's like, that that the folks who are most committed to those kinds of external rewards were the ones who were least likely to get it. Why? We can speculate why. Being an artist is really, really hard. Okay? Doing anything well is really, really hard. It takes a really long time. And you're less likely to stick with it if you don't really love it. And so because they really loved it, it was what I do, they got a lot better at it. They were willing to stick through the long time. The other folks who were more extrinsically motivated, go sell insurance. Not that there's anything wrong with selling insurance. What do you think? One more, then we'll wrap up. Yes, sir.
So that kind of leads me to two fairly related questions.
Okay.
One is, these are things that a manager or a company can provide, incentivize their employees. What about the person who's starting at the bottom level? How can they, kind of start fostering these ideas and these incentive programs and thinking about ways of creating those?
In themselves? Okay.
And then extending that outward from there.
Okay, so let's take that one. So the question, it's a good question. How can someone sort of lower in the ranks foster that in him or foster this kind of sense of motivation in him or herself? Okay, I think people can do a lot more than they think. So let me offer actually a tactical idea on that. Okay, let's talk about performance reviews here for a moment. You're laughing about performance reviews. What's the point of a performance review? Ideally to provide, tell me your first name? Court. Court says ideally to provide feedback. Ideally to provide feedback. Now, we all know that that is actually not the best mechanism for providing feedback. What's wrong with it as a mechanism for providing feedback? It's too late. Very good. Your first name was? Patsy. Patsy says it's too late. What's another flaw in that? It's tied to the money. That's a good point. What about the session itself? Most performance reviews sessions, you know this, it's kabuki theater, okay? It's basically people playing certain kind of rehearsed roles, right? It's not typically, sometimes it is, an open conversation. It's kabuki theater. And so it doesn't work very well. And it's too, as Patsy said, it's too late, and it's also too infrequent. Think about an athlete. Well, athletes get feedback all the time. Serena Williams doesn't have a biannual performance review, I mean, you're laughing, but it's crazy to think about that, right? How are you going to get better at tennis if you only get feedback twice a year, all right? And so I think there's a better way to do this, a better way to do performance reviews, and basically is a much more autonomous way, and I think it's very effective for people that Court says who are not the folks in positions of traditional power. And it is basically to take performance reviews back. Take them back. Do not outsource your performance review to managers or bosses or people of formal authority. Take it back. And here's how it would work. Basically, a do-it-yourself performance review. At the beginning of a month, set out your goals, your learning goals and your performance goals. Okay? Set them out at the beginning of the month. And then at the end of the month, call yourself into the office. Give yourself a stern but loving assessment of how you're doing. Where are you making progress? Where are you falling behind? the other question that we don't ask enough in performance reviews is, what tools or information do you need to do things better? Okay? Ask yourself that question. And that's how you can move toward greater and greater mastery on your own. Take them back. The other thing that's very interesting that goes toward an aspect of Court's question is that what I've seen is that this is happening in a really interesting, somewhat self-organized way. So that you see this, sometimes people will say, oh, it's too weird to call myself into the office. I'm not going to have this secret conversation with myself. But I will have it with a peer, or I will have it with 2 peers, or 3 peers, or 4 peers. And so you see this less inside of organizations, but more among people who are self-employed or small entrepreneurs who will fashion these groups and meet monthly and say, so Court, Patsy, and I meet, and I say, at the beginning of the month, I say, listen, Patsy and Court, here's what I'm hoping to do this next month. Okay, great. Maybe you think about this, that, or the other thing they say to me. They tell me what they're trying to do in the next month. At the end of the month, we meet. We sit down informally, have some coffee. Okay, how'd you do? Well, I didn't quite make those sales calls. Why not, Court? Okay, hold you accountable a little bit, give you feedback. Oh, that was a really, and so people are yearning for this, so they're taking these back in a self-organized way. So I think that that reclaiming performance reviews is one thing that individual contributors can really do to get better at stuff. And I don't think that most organizations are fully committed to helping everybody get better at stuff. And on that note, thanks for having me.